Welcome back to Cream City Social. And we've got another good one for you this week. We sit down with Eric Lohman, who's the president of the union that represents the faculty and staff at UWM. He is a journalism lecturer, or as he'll be quick to point out in the interview, an academic staff. But you may know him best from this podcast. He used to be the host with Scott and MMA in Season 1. He was the professor, professing. And today, he'll be back in that role, teaching us all what a union is and what it can be, and maybe what it has been historically, and what model works best for unionism. But before we hop into the interview, we've got a couple thoughts to share, and then a little story about Eric, who's been in the news lately. He was quoted on TMJ4 and Fox 6, and the ladies in the sorting room at the used bookstore I work at assure me that it was front page news in the Journal Sentinel a couple days back. And so this all started on Friday, September 2nd, when the school administrators at UWM sent out an email to the faculty and staff asking all of them to volunteer their time, unpaid, to cook, serve food, and help clean up the dining halls because they have a shortage of food service workers, and they had to turn students away at the dining halls during the mealtimes. And Eric, president of the union representing these workers, had this to say about it.
I was livid about it.
The school was asking its teachers to fill in as volunteers.
Rather than figuring out a way to hire more workers to fill those roles, they simply asked us to do it for free without overtime pay.
Lohman is president of the union representing faculty and staff at UWM. He says instructors are all for volunteering to help those in need, while calling on the university to fix its own problem instead of causing another.
There is a solution to this problem. They could hire workers to work in the residents' dining halls by paying them better wages and giving them better benefits, but they don't.
Daniel, what did you think about this interview?
I thought it was really interesting. Most of us, when we think about labor unions, we think about negotiating for higher wages, better benefits, better working conditions, and it certainly is about those things, but labor unions are actually more than that. See, labor organizing is a movement-building process based on shared interests between workers. And that awareness that your interests are more closely aligned with your coworkers than your boss is very key to building the support for the progressive reforms that we in DSA want. And if you look at the sewer socialists, if you look at the social welfare states of Europe, or really any broad progressive movement in the 20th century, they originated not as political movements, but as labor organizing movements. And that's not to say that elections aren't important, they certainly are. But if we neglect labor organizing, we're neglecting a very key component in our strategy to win the progressive reforms that we want for the future.
And I'd like to reiterate that this is not a revolt against the department chairs or the dean, because as Eric will say in the interview himself, they've been banging their heads against the wall for years, asking for the same changes that we are. It just doesn't happen without being united, without having the numbers, without being organized into a formidable force that'll take the form of a union. So let's talk to our coworkers, share this podcast with them, and we can all build a better university. And because we're trying to grow here as humans and a podcast, I gotta ask, please share this episode with the people around you, especially if they're on UWM's campus. And like and subscribe and share us on all the social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and slowly but surely, we're uploading our interviews onto the YouTube, as my grandma would say. And with that housekeeping out of the way, here is a very honest conversation with someone making positive change in Milwaukee. Welcome back, Eric.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I'm eager to hop into what we're talking about today because it's near and dear to my heart as a graduate student and a TA at UWM. But I got to ask, since the big announcement last January, handing over the reins of Cream City Social. What have you been up to?
As it turns out, I've been mostly organizing a union. That's been my primary activity. It was actually one of the reasons, the primary reason I would say why I had to give up doing the podcast was while I enjoyed it and I thought it was, a fulfilling, enjoyable endeavor, I just saw myself being drawn in multiple directions, and I needed to focus where I felt I was most needed, and union organizing is where my heart and soul is. So that's where I went, and I had to pass the reins into very capable hands.
Absolutely.
Thanks for saying that.
So let's talk about the union organizing a bit. What conditions are you trying to address here? Why do we need a union in academia?
That's a great question, because teachers' unions have historically occupied a very sort of strange space in that sometimes they've been very conservative unions and sometimes they've been very progressive, depends on the community. But I think with, for example, climate change, police abolition, Roe versus Wade, right? We have a major issue in our country, which is a lack of critical vocabulary. Like, I think a lot of our citizens have steadily consumed a diet of propaganda in our media system. We've lost the ability to critically examine our world, and with very dire consequences. And so to me, public education is vitally important because it teaches us how to think critically, how to self-govern. So without critical education, we can't really have a functional democracy. And public education is always a target for politicians and corporations to continue to diminish the funding that they get. And so teachers' unions to me are critically important because it's the only mechanism that we have to protect this really vital arena in which we can continue to have a democracy. And the only way we can do that is if we have functional public education.
Is that one of your goals, to make education more accessible?
Absolutely. I think anybody who wants to survive on this planet ought to see one of their primary concerns with making sure that our citizens are capable of self-governing in a democracy. And again, I'm a staunch advocate for reduced attention paid to politicians of any stripe, including members of the DSA. I've gotten in conversation. I know it's true. I've gotten in conversations with members, my comrades and colleagues in the DSA, and we have friendly disagreements about the amount of attention we should be paying to electoral politics. I think like when we look at like the recent Roe and like gun legislation, these kinds of issues where we don't really have anything that we would call a sort of functional democracy in which like a mass of people can enact some kind of change. Right. A majority of people can say, we want this thing changed. Let's do that. We don't have that. And we've really never had that. And so to me, like that's an irreconcilable point. Like if you recognize that you don't actually live in a democracy, then why should we continue to pretend like we can enact changes through this mechanism? And that's why to me, unionism is much more valid and important because it's democracy in action, right? It's workers coming together and deciding these are the things we want to do. These are the things we want to change. How do we achieve it? How do we get that thing that we want? Whether that's safer working conditions, whether that's, more time with family and friends, better health insurance, higher wages, whatever it happens to be, you're not going to get that by asking a politician for it, right? You're not going to get that by asking your boss for it. You're going to get that only by organizing those. The only power that we have is in our numbers, right? So organizing that group so that we can say, these are the things that we need, and we're going to get them. Otherwise, this whole thing grinds to a halt. That's how you win.
So in order to get democracy, we have to organize in the workplace.
That's right.
So tell us about your workplace a little bit. What's it like to be an academic worker?
Well, for some academic workers, it's probably pretty good.
Okay.
But for an increasingly large number of us, it is pretty bad. So I am an academic staff person, and so I have a doctorate. I got my PhD in Canada.
Oh, that's pretty.
Yeah, it was gorgeous. I loved it. I loved University of Western Ontario. I was a Mustang, I guess. So there's an increasingly large number of workers who are like me, who are highly educated, who have who were told, go to grad school, go get a PhD, and then someday you can be a professor and you can spend your days, engaged in intellectual pursuits and, teaching students and all these really wonderful things that I really value about my job. And it's why I was drawn to this. But the number of faculty members that exist is diminishing. There's fewer and fewer tenure track jobs available for a number of reasons, primarily because it's much cheaper to employ people like me who have all the on paper credentials and experience to be a professor, but do not have any positions available for me. But they'll entice me to be like, we can still give you a job at the university. You still get an office. People will still call you professor, but you're going to get paid about, half of what a professor is going to make for this work.
You were talking about the averages at UWM.
Yeah. The averages for salary, and I'm hoping that this pod gets heard by my comrades around this campus, because a lot of them will be surprised to find out. The average salary for a UW Milwaukee faculty member is around $99,000 a year, which is nothing to sneeze at. It's good wages, good
livable wage.
Good livable wage for these workers. But again, as I mentioned, they're around now becoming closer to about a third of the teaching staff on any campus in America, including this one. And the average salary for an academic staff person is about $55,000 a year, which is low wages, but there's also going to be many academic staff. I mean, so that's the average, right? So there's many academic staff people on this campus who are making $30,000, $40,000 a year teaching 4 classes, sitting on committees, writing letters of recommendation, advising student clubs, attending events, doing a ton of work. Also, writing books, publishing articles, any number of other academic work that they do not get compensated for at all. So there are lots of people who are thinking $55,000 a year would be a significant wage increase if they were able to get up to the average. So it's pretty wide, a wide disparity.
You're making me think back to all my professors, and I wonder how many of them were adjunct. How many of them were academic staff versus fully tenured professors? Can you tell?
Yeah, I mean, you can ask, you can ask them. That's one way. You can look on your department website, which would tell you what this individual does, like what their official position is, what their rank is on campus. Chances are that the majority of people who educated you on this campus were not tenure track faculty.
2/3.
Yeah.
That's so many.
Do you think most people realize that?
I know my students do not realize that.
Mm-hmm.
No. I know I don't realize that.
No, I'm very open with my students, as I feel we all should be, about our working conditions. I tell my students that I'm not a professor. I'm an academic staff person. I tell them what my wages are, and they're stunned because there's an immediate question, which is, if your wages are poverty wages, then why is my tuition so high, right? What am I paying for then here? If you're and again, if you then start to extrapolate that and be like, oh, well, if all of my professors are academic staff people like you, and they're all making $50,000 a year or so on average, then where the hell is all this money going that we're paying for? And if you don't know who's teaching you and you don't know what their wages are, then that question never logically comes up. But it ought to, right? Because when you start to ask that question, you start to see, well, there seems like a big grift happening here.
I don't want to get sidetracked, but do you know where that money's going? Do you have an idea?
Sure.
Is it just facilities? I mean, I see all these beautiful facilities, not so much on UWM's campus, but I went to Illinois for undergrad, and yeah, it's just building out all the time. Brand new buildings every year.
Yeah, it really depends on where you go. But yes, that is certainly real estate and facilities attract students. So like when students come to around schools and they're thinking, do I want to go to UW Milwaukee, or do I want to go to UW Madison, or do I want to go to Whitewater? Do I want to go to Northern Illinois? Do I want to go to Michigan? They tour these schools, and the attractiveness of the campus, right? Because this is where you're going to live, and this is where you're going to be spending time with other people, and you're going to be living and interacting, and this big chunk of your important adolescent life is going to be spent here. So like the facilities and the things around it and the kind of housing and meal plan and like all these like buildings and these things are what is really attractive. They're not saying like, well, what is the wages of my, my staff members? Are the people teaching me, where did they get their doctorate? These are not questions that 19-year-old students are typally concerned with.
And that probably doesn't factor into rankings, does it?
What? Like
the staff wages?
No. I mean, rankings it's a very complicated and arbitrary process. A lot of it has to do with how many doctoral students are produced from your university. That determines like what your research status is for the university, and that can determine things like funding and attractiveness, like where you get ranked. But yeah, I mean, when students show up here, like they're looking at the facilities, looking at the buildings, they're looking at the sort of student culture, the activities happening there, not the working conditions of the people on the campus. Even though, of course, that's where, the greatest impact on their student life is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is an issue that's especially bad in Wisconsin, or is this something we're seeing nationwide?
So I think the problem in higher ed is widely understood and widely felt. I don't necessarily think that. I think one of the major problems is that people who typically, devote their lives to higher education as practitioners are really heavily invested in maintaining that system. I think that they bought into a sort of mythology about this as a calling, and the university has this special, unique place in our culture, and they don't think about it as a job. And if they thought about it as a job, they would think about things very, very differently. And I think this is a widespread problem around the country, which is I bought into it as a younger academic. Like, I didn't want to work a full-time job anymore where I was like out in, I always tell I got fired from my first job for trying to organize a union, like right out of high school. Very naive. But I didn't want to do, like, I saw that the physical toll that this kind of labor took on people, and I wanted to spend time reading and talking and thinking. And so that's why I pursued this career. And I think that's why a lot of people pursue this career. And then they come to find out that it's just a regular job where you're just being exploited, and there's a massive grift happening. And then you have to then tell yourself that you've devoted your life to this lie, or to this, at the very least, this mythology. And, extracting yourself from that is difficult, as it is for a lot of us to try to figure out, like, oh, this thing that I really enjoyed or really was heavily invested in turned out to be something I didn't think it was. That's a hard, the come to Jesus moment, as it's been described. Like, you have to come and reconcile, like, what do I do now when this happens? That's a difficult thing for people to do. And I think that that's why a lot of this exploitation in higher ed has persisted for longer than it should have, because of that mythology that so many of these people have bought into, including myself.
I was going to say, same here. A professor's life seems idyllic to me.
Yeah, of course, right? Summers, you get off, spend your time with brilliant, bright-minded students who are, eager to learn and explore. Like, that's a fascinating. I would do this. So I always tell myself I would do this if I would do this for free. Like, if we lived in a society in which I didn't have to concern myself with starvation and healthcare, then this is what I would be doing all the time. And so
this is what you're drawn to.
Yeah, this is what I love, right? Yeah, and I maintain that. But the university system recognizes that in us, and exploits it, right? Uses that as a mechanism to say, well, I wonder how low these wages will go then, if that's what you're willing to do. If you're willing to work for free, let's try it out, right? Let's see if next to free will work.
And that kind of goes into what you were talking about. 1/3 of the staff is now faculty, tenured track, gets paid the $99,000 average wage, and then 2/3 of them is this academic staff. When did that start happening?
Yeah,
has that been a slow project?
Yeah, so it's been a slow project.
Process.
Yeah, slow process.
Not an evil project behind the scenes, but process.
Well, it sort of is.
It's not an evil project.
So there was political backlash, specifically starting in the late 1960s, because of the anti-war movement, hippie movement, civil rights movement, feminist movement. All of those were housed primarily in humanities departments on public universities, right? And so in the 1960s, then state governments began to recognize what that meant and started to defund and to redirect funds away from these kinds of programs, again, towards STEM fields, ones that were much more capital intensive, that could create public-private partnerships. You're also, again, eliminating these very important critical education for our citizens who are now less likely to get the kind of critical pedagogy that they need to self-govern, right? And instead, they're focused almost entirely on fields that earn wages, high wages, build, get your house in the suburbs, fill it up with commodities, et cetera, et cetera.
Do you think this kind of goes hand in hand with the way we kind of devalue humanities?
Yeah.
It's the only thing that's important are things that make money, like business and engineering.
Correct. And it's worked pretty well for the capitalist class to do that. And again, I think the perhaps the unintended consequence of that, or maybe it was intended, was again to make it so that our public itself lacks the ability to understand, even our public lacks the ability to even understand what a conspiracy theory is and how it functions and like why it exists, right? They don't understand what propaganda is. They don't understand. And again, it's not their fault, right?
No, I have a hard time with it.
Right.
We all get sucked into it.
Correct. I mean, you're up against an incredibly formidable and well-funded propaganda campaign, of which there have been very smart people who have spent decades and decades and decades learning how to persuade people without them knowing, right? And so when you do that, right, you can't really expect then our citizenry, without any critical education about how to combat this thing, to do anything about it, right? And that's why we have, so many of these internet-related conspiracy theories circulating where people have no understanding about what any of it means.
I think about this kind of thing a lot when I see people post on Facebook or something. Why doesn't school teach us to do taxes or things like that? A lot of people think that education is just so you can get a job and make money for someone else a lot of the time.
Certainly. And not to say that,
it's pretty helpful to do that, if I'm being
financial
honest.
literacy skills wouldn't be helpful for students to learn. Certainly would be. But I think you're right in that there's always this question of like, why aren't the schools doing X, Y, and Z? And I'm always like, the answer is because you refuse to fund, you refuse to give these teachers what they need to do this work, or to support, say, school board candidates that are considering like a radical transformation of education. Like, to me, my belief is that if we do not shift our educational model away, or I should say back towards a focus on humanities, our humanity itself, and how we can live in a democracy and self-govern, then we will die on this planet, right? Very, very soon. So like, to me, like, we're not competing with the Russians anymore for like, this isn't the Cold War. Like, we should stop, focusing all of our attention. Not to say, of course, that like math and STEM aren't important. They're valuable, right? But they're not the end all be all, right? And it shouldn't be about what, making little workers out of our citizens, but instead creating citizens who can decide what they want to do with this planet once we're gone.
And I think it's important even for those engineers and STEM folks to have the humanities education. I know I only took an undergrad engineering courses and very much got trained in a way to think like an engineer. Very ins and outs, black box, and inputs, outputs, and how the efficiency works. But then I got here and got a little bit more involved in the humanities. I've taken some economics classes, which isn't really humanities, but political science, some journalism classes. That's kind of how I ended up here. And it's helped me in engineering too. I mean, the way I see these problems now is a much more wide view. It helps with critical thinking.
Yeah.
So I think it is our only positive thing to well-round even our engineers.
Absolutely.
Us crazy folk.
Yeah, I love engineering. I mean, we're not going to be able to have practical solutions to technological, social, environmental problems if we don't have engineers. But we have to also have a group of engineers who say, the reason I'm doing this is to save our humanity, to save our planet, not to make myself a millionaire by making the next, whatever, the next great app or the next product or something like that, right? That's where this comes in to say, like, what are we directing our citizens to do, right? What are we asking them to learn this stuff for, right? Habitually, it's been pursuit of private profit, right? To make yourself, as valuable as you can as an asset and accumulate wealth. Whereas we see what that's gotten us. And so it isn't to say that we can't have, these fields. We definitely do need them, but we do need them to be in service of our humanity instead of in service of private property, accumulation of wealth.
That's the perfect way to say it. What are we building this stuff for?
Right. Why?
Which doesn't get asked as an
engineer. It never
engineer.
gets asked.
We love math.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested how this can tie into our original topic, which was unionization.
Yes.
Do you think a union could help kind of shift the conversation around these issues?
Definitely. And so I think, is a perfect segue, because my understanding or my belief in what unionism is about democracy, right? And because to me, I think that the biggest problem that we have, as I've described, is a lack of critical understanding about how we self-govern. And so unionism is the only way that I see us sort of working our way out of this problem. And I imagine some of the listeners are probably wondering, well, how that is possible.
How does that look?
Right, and how does that look? And the reason that question usually comes up is because most people have a understanding about unionism that follows a particular model that I reject, that I think is outdated, and that is a very serious problem. It's called the service model of unionism, sometimes called the mobilization model of unionism. There's another term for it, which is now escaping me. But they basically describe the way that unions have existed in North America for about the same time, since about the 1970s. Once major corporations and companies started moving jobs overseas, primarily to break the power of industrial factory unions, it left more or less only ununionized workers in the United States and then public sector workers, right? And then once you crushed the private sector unions by moving jobs to non-union countries or states.
The South.
The South, right? The global South or the actual South of the United States. Either one would work. then you're left with only public sector workers, and then legislatures then spent, the next couple of decades crushing those unions. So there we now have like this unorganized, deeply exploited workforce. Now, the unions that have existed in that time period have faced a very significant set of problems, which is how do we rebuild these unions and in, say, the public sector arena when workers don't feel like anything can come of it? A lot of cases because the legislatures have, undercut their ability to organize, like in the case of Wisconsin, or have created right-to-work states in which, workers in a union shop are covered by a collective agreement, but they don't have to pay dues, right? So it means that like everybody in the workplace, let's say that UWM had a collective agreement, it means every faculty member, let's say, was covered by that collective agreement, but they would have to opt in to pay, right? So what it means is they have a collective agreement that covers them, but they don't have to pay any dues. They don't have to be involved in the union at all. That's what a right to work state is in a nutshell. So it makes it so that the union has no funding, because why would you pay, $30 a month to be a member of the union when you get a collective agreement out of it anyways, right? And a lot of times what would happen is that people would show up and they would ask for help from the union when their boss was sexually harassing them or something like that, but they still wouldn't pay the dues. But the union was still required and still is required to help them. So these are the ways in which you weaken unionism. And so what it did is it forced these unions to try to maintain some kind of strength in that environment. And what they did was they adopted the service model, which was, okay, we're not going to engage in like strikes and activism. We're not going to be, turning over tables and stopping work. Instead, what we're going to do is try to create a close collaborative relationship with the people in power, the bosses, the corporations. And so we can try to offer services to workers, and that way they'll pay those dues to us. Because again, so if they're covered by a collective agreement and they don't have to pay dues to get covered by it, then why would they ever bother, right? So then the question says, well, we have to entice them, and we do that by offering them services like supplemental dental insurance, or in like nursing, for example, sometimes they might offer liability insurance, which is a good thing. Not to say it's bad, sure. But basically, it's like the union then becomes this model for like a business model, right? Which is attracting people to it and saying like, we're going to be professional. We're going to have a collaborative relationship with the boss. We're going to make it worth your while to join the union. So then they can build up that union, build dues. And what that did is it created a model then in workers' minds in which the union is this kind of third party, this thing that like, I pay dues to you and then you get me the services I want. Or if I have a problem with my boss, then I'll call on you and you come help me. But otherwise, staff and executives do all the work and union members are just dues paying and they kind of stay out of it.
It's interesting because I'm wondering if a lot of the criticisms that people typically have of unions, the out-of-touch leadership, the corruption,
yep,
if it's related to the transition to the service model.
100% true, right? And so think about it, right? The union is not particularly responsive, right? There's a lot of then staff members who and I have lots of friends and comrades who have been union staff members. I love them. But they're not union members, right? So there's a very big difference between a staff of a union, let's say a nursing union, where they have 30 people doing research and organizing and advocacy, versus the nurses who are on a floor of a hospital, right? Those two groups of people, they might have a shared goal, which is how do we, increase the livable standards for these nurses? But they have a very different understanding about what the work looks like, right? And so they might say, well, this is the nurses on that floor may say, this is what we want to do. And then the staff of that union say, that's not a great idea because, for whatever reason, maybe because they think they know better, or maybe because it might impact their job. It might be a number of reasons. Say like, well, that's good, but it might antagonize the boss, so we're not going to pursue that. Right? So what it does is undercuts the solidarity. It undercuts the workplace democracy that typically builds organically in a workplace.
I was just going to say that it seems like... So that almost feels like it creates an incentive for these staff to have a cozy relationship with the administrators, with the people in charge, right?
Yeah.
If they're providing a service, they have to provide that service, they have to have a good working relationship with the bosses.
Correct.
And so it's not in their interest to create a lot of conflict.
Right. And so one of the the reasons that the service model of unionism is so vital for especially socialists and activists on the left to understand is because it is replicated within our democratic model as well, right? This is what our political system looks like. It looks exactly the same.
That is
You
what the
nominate
Democrats look like.
this is why I don't, yeah, this is why I have a real problem with electoral politics, because it's a service model of democracy. It's basically saying, like, why don't you elect this person, and then they'll go off and they'll advocate on your behalf. And if you need something, you call them, right? But what do they do? And again, this would be even comrades like socialists who are elected officials. They are stuck living and working in an environment that is not conducive to the kind of activism that the workers on the ground demand, right? So you get into a political position, and you have to start making compromises and deals, or you have to say, like, well, I have to get reelected, right? So how do I make sure that I'm not entirely alienating my base, even if that base is largely progressive, right? Even if that base, goes out and knocks on doors for you, right? You're still representing a large swath of people. You still have to make compromises and deals with other members of your, county board, common council, your legislature, right? And again, it also shifts that model away from what we really need it to be, which is workers and citizens need to see themselves as part of the democratic process, not something we delegate to other people to do, right? Whether that be a politician or whether that be a union leadership, right? Democracy has to be something that we do rather than something that we elect other people to do. Because as long as we're electing other people to do it, this is what we end up with, right? We end up with a democratic system that is unresponsive to us, a legislative system that is unresponsive to us, and a workplace system that is unresponsive to our needs.
So I'm wondering, once the service model takes hold, does it become very entrenched? Is it difficult to kind of get back to that organization model?
Yes. So absolutely. And one of the first barriers to this, as I think we'll just sort of describe, was the, or maybe it was you actually, with like the idea that like unions have this bad reputation as being bureaucratic, as protecting lazy workers, of being corrupt. There's a very legitimate critique that unions are too closely aligned with the Democratic Party, a critique that I believe is true, 100%, and ought to be addressed, right? Because we give the Democrats a lot of power when unions donate money or knock on doors for them. And then what do we ask for in return? That they not be Republicans, right? That's it. We don't ask them to pass legislation as pro-worker, right? We don't ask them to appoint pro-labor, people to these boards and committees and things like that. We just go knock on doors for them because we're terrified of allowing a Republican to get into office because of what they will do to labor. But instead we accept jack shit from the Democrats in exchange for our political support. So I fundamentally believe that unions ought to not give the Democrats any support, whether that be political, social, activist, until we can get things in return from them. Because again, I think it replicates this model of service model unions where we say, like, I trust you to do this for us. And I think it's a foolish thing for any of us to do, is to give trust to anybody else under these circumstances.
Can we linger here for a second?
Sure.
I don't want to get too far away, but what does a democracy that we're all very engaged in look like?
We've never had it.
Where it's not a service model.
We've never had a democracy that looked that way, so it's impossible to know.
Well, maybe like Catalonia or
I mean, so there's been,
Americans.
there have been workplace democracies that have functioned this way, right? Like, and so I think that one of the things is that we have to reimagine what democracy looks like and then build it as we go along. And that is a difficult process, right? But it's also one that is rewarding. And I think, like, you watched that video from Jane McAlevey where, they were organizing that hospital in Berlin. That's what democracy looks like, right? It looks like everybody there, everybody involved, right? So how can we really truly say that we have a democracy when, 50% of our population doesn't vote, right? And then a politician is elected in a heavily gerrymandered district with, 49% of the, you're talking about less than a quarter of the people that are represented are like, that's not a democracy. There's nothing close to a democracy. Right? Something like democracy would have to include those people, and they would have to be able to have a say in what happens and be invested in the process. That's what real democracy would look like. And it's difficult to do that in a large scale.
Yeah.
But it's not that difficult to do when you're thinking about your workplace, right? Your workplace is, if you would try to include everybody in your workplace, now you're talking about significantly fewer people. You're still talking about a lot, but those people will do two things. One, they will change their living conditions by fundamentally changing their workplace, right? Their wages, the hours they spend there, the amount of time they spend with their family, vacation, healthcare, all those things are embedded within your workplace. So organizing your workplace makes sense for that reason. And second, it just teaches us what democracy actually can look like, which is, I'm going to talk to the people who I don't agree with already. I'm going to find out what their issues are, what matters to them, and I'm going to help them achieve that thing because it probably would help me as well, right? Because when you disembed yourself from electoral politics and partisan politics, and you start having conversations with other workers, you find that immediately you have exactly the same interests, right? And that's why class matters in this way. And so then you can start to address other types of issues like gender oppression, sexual oppression, right? Racism, homophobia, these things that also permeate within our culture, they can be addressed in your workplace, right? Democratically, on the ground by saying like, all right, well, this is an issue that we need to make sure it doesn't happen. So you can't fix this by like, sending Mandela Barnes to Senate, right? Like he's not going to fix it. He can't do anything about this. And even if he could, it could be undone again, as we've seen multiple times.
As we
right?
just saw.
So as long as we continue to treat democracy as this kind of give and take, 4 years, see what we can get, 4 years it gets taken away, let's try again. We all burn to death on this planet in the meantime. So like democracy has to be something that we, again, engage in on the ground in a sort of deep way with each other that, again, separates and exculpates ourselves from electoral and partisan politics.
So how do we do that? How do we move away from this service model to a more organizational model?
Yeah, so the organizational model, it focuses and centers a couple of really important differences from the service model. So I think first step is understanding that the service model is the primary model, but it isn't the only one. So when people talk about their dislike of unions, it should be a very easy thing to say, I also hate these kinds of unions.
I dislike service union models.
Yes, I abhor these models because the same reason I abhor electoral politics, right? Because they are inadequate for meeting the needs of the most oppressed in our society and in our culture. So understanding that that service model unionism is only one kind of unionism, then you say, okay, well, what other kinds could we build? What other kinds exist? And the mobilizing model of unionism was the first model. It was the original model. It was the CIO, Congress of Industrial Workers model, which focused on grassroots organizing, workplace organizing on the ground in which members see themselves as the union, not see the executive or staff as the union. They see themselves as a coalition, an organization of workers. And so the other issues are...
What happens there when they see themselves as part of the union, the union?
Yeah, fundamental changes. I mean, specifically, you have to ensure that two criteria are met if this is going to be successful. Number one, it has to be democratic. It has to be actually democratic, which means that you might not always get all the things that you want. It means, again, talking to people who disagree with you. It means a slow process in some cases of working through and making sure that everybody's objections are met. But that's how you get buy-in, right? That's how you get a coalition of workers who are diverse, all moving towards the same goal, right? Otherwise, that never really happens. And the second issue you have to make sure is transparency, right? All the workers in that unit, in that effort, have to fully and transparently believe that there isn't anybody who has an alternative motive, right? That is trying to work against them, that is trying to strategically motivate them to do something so that they can get something out of it, right? Like, this happens a lot with service model unionism, where it's a kind of trade-off. Like, we get all these people and we say like, all right, well, we'll get you this, but maybe these workers' wages could drop a little bit. This has happened in a lot of unions who have organized contracts and they have a gag order, right? A gag rule, which means that the bargaining committee, so let's say we have a union here and we nominate 5 people to be on the bargaining committee. So they go meet with the boss. Those 5 people go meet with the boss and they bargain a contract on our behalf. Well, the employer will make them sign a gag rule that says that they're not allowed to discuss this with the workers during the process. So imagine that, right? Imagine getting a contract 6 months from now that says, here are your wage increases, take it or leave it. And you had no say in the process at all, right? It was traded away by negotiators without your consent. So of course, why are people going to be invested in this model of unionism when that's what it looks like? They're like, oh, what's the point of this? I didn't have a say in this. I didn't have a role in this. I would have asked for more. I would have gone out on strike. I would have done more than this. And they just say, well, we couldn't really do much about it at the time. So this is what you get. So that's the service model. And that's why shifting away from that to the mobile or the organizing model is a better fit, because it addresses those two major issues of democracy and transparency. It gets all those workers involved in the process. So again, as you mentioned, so they feel.
Yeah.
And feeling like you have a say in your life. That's what democracy is about. Having a say in, like, I work at this place, but I determine how much time I get to spend with my family. I determine if I'm going to starve here. I determine whether or not the workers on this campus are being treated poorly because they're gender diverse. Like, I can do something about these things. And you have an obligation then. There's another reason that that democracy doesn't work when you have electoral or service model, is because again, why would you bother participating when you know from the get-go it couldn't make a difference at all, right? It's not going to happen.
And you have no say in it.
You have no say.
You have no power.
Your power is to vote, and that's it. And the candidates that end up on the ballot, you don't really have much of a say about that. You don't have a say in how they get funded, and you have no say about what happens when they get there.
I thought it was interesting, something you touched on before. It seems like you're saying the service model kind of encourages this idea that we're separate classes or dividing people. And I think you could say that a lot about our quote-unquote democratic system as well. So I also see this potentially as a challenge to creating an organizational model too. You mentioned some staff are paid higher. Do you think there could be like class issues or barriers to creating an organizational model? And how do we kind of get back to this idea that we're all one collective force?
This is tough. This is a great question because it is tough. There's a lot of entrenched mythology and ideology, a lot of merit. I mean, especially the university, for all of its benefits, one of the major faults is that it is a meritocracy, right? There are a lot of people who are in positions of power here who believe that they are there because of how smart they are and how good they are and what they've published. And the reality is that these are probably lots of wealthy white people who are there not necessarily because of their skills, but because they got lucky, and they're much less likely to believe that somebody who isn't in that kind of position is deserving of it. So this is something we have to battle back against in a lot of different arenas within our society and within our culture, and it is heavily entrenched within the university. And it's going to be a struggle, I think, to overcome a lot of that here. I won't lie to you.
And let's give these professors credit. Let's give these people credit. They are smart. And it's just a very easy trap for smart people to get into, that I'm smart. I'm the smartest.
Right.
It's so easy to feed into that ego.
But I think do you think they could benefit from a union as well, though?
Yeah, of course. And I think that I think they will benefit from the union. I think it's going to be, I think it's not going to be a difficult sale or pitch or idea once we start to have some of these conversations with them. Because look, the average wage for faculty on this campus is $99,000, but the average in, say, a department like foreign languages is around $77,000 a year, right? So they're $20,000 average below the campus average, right? So there are tenure track faculty that have been working here for a decade that are making less than academic staff members in Lubar, right, who are making $110,000 a year, right? So there's also issues around tenure and how tenure is achieved, about governance in the department, about diminishing resources, about how much time these tenure track faculty spend engaged in activities that are not research or teaching, but are governance related. So the faculty have a lot of gripes, a lot of legitimate issues on this campus. The issue is that they have to see the solution to that problem as unionizing and organizing with us instead of trying to talk to the boss. And this is one of the issues, like the faculty on most campuses, especially this one, they have bought into the sort of liberal belief that the system is not bad. There are just bad actors within it. And if I just get into a position of power, I can change it. As smart as
seductive.
They are. It's very seductive, but for as smart as they are, they should realize that is a ploy that only serves to protect the status quo. And so you cannot get into a position of power and then change it from the inside, because if that were possible, somebody would have done it before you.
Seems like that might be the more comfortable option too.
Right.
I mean, the organizational model does, it seems, require some kind of risk.
The mobilization model requires some amount of risk. The service model, is pretty risk-free, and that's why it's so attractive to very risk-averse people who are heavily entrenched in the system, who believe, like, if we just get enough people in the union, we can ask for better wages and maybe get them, right?
So how do we reach those kind of people?
I think we just have to talk to them. I think we have to have conversations with them in which we find out what their issues are and help them understand how the union can help them solve that problem. It's not as difficult as it seems for a lot of them, because many of the tenure track faculty who have been around this campus for a long time have been beating their heads against the wall trying to get things changed, only to find that it is a brick wall, that it is bureaucratic, it is, a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of, I would love to help you, but, the budget's tight. What are we going to do about it? And they've given up trying to fight because they believe that the only thing that they can do is vote or service model unionism. Like they've given up on the idea that there's another path forward, and that's the path that our local is going to have to help them understand.
And maybe the best way to walk through this is to talk through Jane McCallie's video that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And we'll link to it in the description. But where they had just won the union right to unionize, and they got the union. But then they went to the collective bargaining table and were trying to bargain with their employers, and pretty quickly found out that nothing was going to happen. The employers were not willing to make any concessions, and it wasn't going to happen unless they went on strike.
Right.
But they didn't have enough people to quite go on strike yet. They were at like 80%, and it needs 90%, 95%. Everybody needs to be bought in for this to work. And it's how do you reach that last 15%? How do you reach the people who aren't on board with you already? And maybe you can talk to that in that story, because I thought it was really cool. It was how you meet them where they are. You talk to them and figure out what they need.
Yeah.
Everybody needs something.
Yeah, exactly right. So in the Jay McAlevey video, but she's one of the most well-known and strongest advocates for the organizing model. And because she's won huge contracts, progressive contracts for workers in a lot of different places using this model, including the Chicago Teachers Union, the public school teachers in Chicago, who took on Rahm Emanuel
cool.
and were able to, again, go out on strike. 43,000 workers or something like that, 43,000 teachers. They had spent a year in advance building networks of support within parents in public schools, right? So that when they decided that like we have a supermajority of workers who are willing to go out on strike, the employer listens. And again, this is the problem with the service model and the democratic model was why do you care if only a fraction of the people give a shit about this problem and are going to do something about it? You can easily battle back against that, but you can't fight against everybody, right? You can't fire them all. And so when you build to a supermajority of workers, that's when you can actually achieve some outcome. But again, you have to have them involved. So it has to be, again, democratic and transparent. And this is what McAlevey does really well. So in the case of like Einstein Medical, I think it was in Philadelphia or something like that. Yeah. They didn't quite have the numbers yet. And so they were like, all right, we're going to map this. We're going to find every department. We're going to find everybody in them. We're going to go talk to them. We're going to help them understand what the union is going to be able to do for them. Find out what their issue is, have a conversation. You know, she talks about like, some of the departments where they were like no movement on an issue, and then finding like the one person in that department,
the informal leader,
finding out who that person is and what their issue is and help them understand how the union can help. So in the case of the hospital at Einstein Medical, it was one worker who didn't like being mandated. And this is a common problem in nursing. My partner is a vice president of the VA union, nursing union, and this is a problem there as well. It's a problem in hospitals across the country, which is when you have fewer staff, you have to force them to stay at work or force them to come into work on their off hours in order to cover critical shortages, right? Otherwise, people die. So this was the workplace issue. It wasn't even tied to wages, right? This is, again, what people think about. They're like, well, the union can help me as an individual, or it can collectively bargain on behalf of something. But this was an issue where she says, I don't want this to happen to us anymore. And they were like, great, join us, because none of us want this to happen either. So this becomes your wedge issue, right? This becomes the thing that says we can stop mandation, right? We can stop mandating nurses.
That they're on call and then they have to be by the phone at all times. You can't have a drink. You can't go for a hike. You have to be ready for work at all times.
Right. And it's not, you know, and their wages aren't great, right? In many cases. So you're saying like, not only do you have to sit by your phone all the time and you can't go do things that are fun, it's not like you're making a doctor's wages for this either, right? You're making a nurse's wages.
Not even nurse's wages. You're making on-call wages.
You're right.
Because you're technically not working.
Right.
So it could be like $1 an hour. Who knows?
Right. It could be, who knows, right? And again, without a good collective bargaining agreement that says like, fine, if you're going to mandate me, this is what we expect. You know, it's funny to bring it up because I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's the California Nurses Union. They were battling against, and they have a pretty strong union out there. They were battling against mandating from their system. And one of the things that they won in their collective bargaining agreement is that management has to staff the floor before they're allowed to mandate employees. So like if they're like, you have to come in on your off time, it's like, no, actually you have to put on a nurse's outfit and you have to come work the floor, which they then do, because if they can't cover these shortages, rather than like calling you from home and me going home for the weekend, right, and making you stay and work a double, they have to put on, you know, their uniform and go staff, right? So that's something that's in the collective bargaining agreement for these California nurses. Which again is not about wages, but about working conditions, about how much time you get to spend with your family. You know, my goal here then is to build is first off to help workers here understand what the organizing model looks like, why it's different from the service model of unionism, and to advocate for its adoption, and then to build, right, to help and to basically go through these, these conversations with these workers and help them understand why they should join and what we intend to do about it. What are the kinds of issues that we seek to address? I think one critical issue is a minimum wage for TAs, grad workers, and academic staff, right? Because as I mentioned, I know firsthand that there are academic staff workers on this campus who are working 40 hours a week during the semesters and are making $35,000, $40,000 a year, right? Which is unacceptable as a wage. And so we need a minimum wage for them, and we need clear understanding about how much work you're supposed to be doing, right? So there's another issue related to wages, which is some academic staff people might teach 3 classes a semester and do advising, or advising, other kinds of work, like in jams in our department, there's like ad and PR work, internship supervision. There's a lot of other kinds of things that students require from us that we provide as services. And so as a result of that, we get a course drop, right? So that we teach 3 classes instead of 4. But then there are people who are also academic staff people in other departments who do all that same work as us, but also teach 4 classes. Right. And make less than us, right? Because we were able to work this out with our department and with our executive committee. So this is the kind of arrangement that we have, but it's not universal. And so the disparity, and again, you're probably not surprised to find out that a lot of the people who are being more exploited around campus are humanities departments that are heavily people of color, lots of women or gender diverse people are the ones who suffer, obviously the worst in this arrangement. So we need a minimum understanding. So we need the university to say, like, this is what your job is, this is what the work that you do is, and this is how much you get paid to do it.
It's weird in the engineering department. It's a little bit different where it's not quite the same minimum wage, and I'm thinking of TAs here. But TAs, you get a stipend, and that's usually $2,500 in total. You get 100% of the stipend, you get $2,500, which it's enough to live, right? As a grad student, you're getting your school paid for. So that ends up being like $25,000 a year, $30,000 a year. You can survive for a little bit as you're getting your education that way. But what they do is they bring in a bunch of international kids, and then they give them 33% of a stipend.
Yeah.
So most everybody in my lab and most everybody in the engineering department is living on $900 a month, 33% of that $2,500.
That's outrageous.
And then these international students, so luckily, I'm a citizen, and so I can get other jobs if I need to. I can work other places. As a international student, you're on a visa, and you're limited to 20 hours a week per work, 20-hour work week. And the 33% RA is 20 hours of work, supposedly. So there's no option for you to go work other places. I've heard of people being bouncers for cash at certain places, and you have to kind of go underground, start the black market. And it's bad.
Yeah,
it's really
it's
bad.
Outrageous. It's criminal. And again,
it feels like they're taking advantage.
Totally. And there's a lot of problems with this. Number one, TAs are very often the first point of contact for students, right? So like and again, this is like, TAs aren't going around telling their undergraduate students how difficult it is to live and work like this, right? Instead, they devote all of their energy to academia, right? Of making sure that these students have a good, positive experience, right? And
you want to,
right?
It feels so bad to not do that
Correct.
you just do it,
right? And so this is why this group of workers as well are particularly primed to understand this, because you're providing a valuable service that the university makes a ton of money off of, right? And you're doing it for absolutely poverty subsistence.
$1,000 a month.
Yeah, which again, criminal. It's outrageous. And you're doing is you're making this sacrifice just so the hope is that someday it'll pay off for you. But if you intend to stay in academia, it won't, right? It will not. You might, again, in engineering, you might be able to go to the private sector.
Luckily, it does end up paying off in the end.
Right, for an engineer. But for a humanities scholar, forget about it, right? It is not going to pay off in the end. You're not going to get a tenure track job, right? You might get a job in academia, but it will be heavily supported, right? It'll be heavily support role, right? It'll be, adjunct for a while, teaching a bunch of classes. Maybe teaching at multiple campuses is also very common for adjuncts to do, which is, if you get a contract for $5,000 to teach, one class at UW Milwaukee, well, you can't live on that. So you might also get an adjunct job at Marquette doing the same thing, teaching the same class or a different kind of class. Or maybe some, in worse circumstances, would drive down to Whitewater, Parkside, right? Driving up to Madison, driving, to Concordia, right? Driving all around the area, teaching classes, piecing together, which of course in this economy doesn't even pay for the gas that it would cost to get around these places. So, but this is a very common academic life, right? Which is to, no office, no permanent residence, no health insurance, none of that. Just like straight cash, not straight cash, but you know what I mean? Like your compensation is,
is it
money only, right? No summer work, no, nothing else. And no guarantee that you'll even have a job come the next semester.
And I just think about the students. If I was paid more, I would honestly give more time to my students.
Of course.
I just don't have the time because I'm working other jobs, trying to make money other ways.
Right.
An adjunct professor's got to be the same way. If you're teaching at Marquette, UWM, Whitewater, just think how spread across you are. In different classes, I'm sure you're just taking whatever class you can get.
Yeah.
Its quality has to go down.
It absolutely does. But again, when the university starts to treat its mission here not as to create a population, a society of citizens capable of self-governing, but instead what you're trying to do is create a group of citizens that are indebted to you so that they have to perpetually accept whatever low-wage job that you will give them so that they don't starve to death and they can pay their loans off. Well, now you have a completely and fundamentally different model in which the administration couldn't care less about the quality of education that you get because your job is to get debt and work for them. That's it. So again, a fundamental, and this is why I think so many workers on this campus need to understand what they're actually doing here, right? You're not doing this noble job that you think you are. Instead, you're participating in an exploitative relationship in which we grift a bunch of people and give them nothing in return for it, right? We're taking a bunch of we're putting them in perpetual debt, funneling that money up to God knows where, and we have this exploited mass of teachers in the middle of this, right, who are doing their best to try to educate their students under incredibly in deteriorating circumstances.
It just feels like everybody loses.
Not everybody.
Well, there's a couple people
There's always
that
a
win.
big class of people who are benefiting a lot from this system. And the issue becomes understanding who those people are and organizing us so that we can fight against them, right, instead of fighting with each other.
So who are these people?
They're politicians, and they are bosses. They are the capitalist class, and they are people who work in service of that class. So there are lots of people on this campus who occupy these powerful positions who are not bad people, right? They're not evil people. They have bought into a system in which they benefit significantly from it, and so it has taught them to turn the other cheek or to justify exploitation as an inevitable part of the way the system works. I might be able to convince them to abandon it. Probably not. There's a famous saying, I can't remember who said it. I want to say it was Mark Twain, but maybe it wasn't. But it's difficult to get people to understand that that exploitation is happening or a problem is happening when they benefit financially from it, right? I can't remember who said it. I totally botched whoever said it.
Was it it's hard to get a man to understand something when his living depends on him not understanding
it. Exactly right. Yeah, much better said. Exactly right. So there are people, and this is the group of people that typically then adopt the service model of unionism or are sort of liberal justifications for the status quo as it exists, which is, and think about what drives it, which is, we can't tear this whole thing down because then I lose a lot of what I love, and I earned it through my own hard work and my own smart and my own grit. Right. So your exploitation and my success are part of a complex that we cannot dismantle, right? Because getting things better for you might mean things get a little bit worse for me.
Is that true though?
No, I think absolutely not. I mean, it depends on how you define it, right? But I think that we as a society, we have more than enough productive energy and capacity to make it so that we can fix this planet and live on it in a survivable way without exploiting everybody and working us all to death. I think that's a totally achievable goal. And I think that may require some people to have less wealth, but very likely it's not going to impact the people who live around here, right? The people who are working here. The vast majority of these people, there are some wealthier people making a couple $100,000 a year, but this is not the capitalist class. These are people who have been paid to protect that capitalist class, right? And so, frankly, I don't care what happens to them. They can either get on board or not, but the masses, like the vast majority of us who are working here, are only going to continue to accept these kinds of conditions for so long. But I think that there's a number of people who would be motivated to understand that the system doesn't have to be so exploitative. It doesn't have to work this way.
And in my mind, that means somebody stops making $250,000 and now drops down to $100,000, joins the rest of us, and lives a regular human life.
Right. It lives
Is that so bad?
Right. Lives in a way that is sustainable for the planet, that lives in a way that is sustainable housing and food and water consumption and like all these other needs that serve humanity rather than serve, ego or serve capital and so on. So like there is going to require a radical, I think, reimagining of like what our moral sort of compass is as a society towards like the greater good, the public interest, right? Making sure that the most vulnerable in our population have exactly what they need. And then beyond that, like, who gives a shit, right? Like, I don't really care. At that point, like, if all these needs are met, if every citizen on this planet has what they need to survive, doesn't spend their whole life working, has adequate healthcare, then private accumulation of wealth means a lot less, right? In the grand scheme of things, you say, like, you can't have it all, right? But if you want more, I don't care. As long as everybody has what they need, that's acceptable, right? Like, that's, the DSA has a model that's very similar to this, this idea. I think that might be putting the cart before the horse, right? Because we have so much significant exploitation to say, like, what's going to happen to these individuals. I think what's going to happen to them if they do nothing is that their children die on a burning planet, right? And if they're not killed under fascism first. So that makes it a little easier to have that conversation when we say, like, I don't really give a shit so much about whether or not you make $400,000 a year or $200,000 a year. You can say, like, well, there's bigger fish to fry here.
So what are the first steps? Now that we've sketched out all this gloom and doom and the world's going to end, what are our first steps in revitalizing this union?
So the first steps are talking to people about the organizing model of unionism, about what AFT Local 3535 is attempting to do, and helping people understand that what they think about the union is probably outdated, and that what we're talking about is them organizing and getting involved with their coworkers to democratically and transparently improve the working conditions on their campus or in their workplace, and then from that point to start to transform the living and working conditions in our communities and in our society. To me, that's the simple pitch, right? It's very easy.
Start talking to your people around you.
Start talking to your coworkers. Start talking to people around you about what they want to see in their workplace, what they want to see change, and then help them understand how the union can do that. And get them involved through that sort of basic process, the simple conversations, right? Once we start to build some density and have these conversations, we can start to understand better democratically about what people need and how the union can start to address those concerns.
I'm wondering, how do we avoid unions devolving into this service model in the future? How do we recognize when it's becoming that and sort of react to it?
That's a fantastic question. That's a hard one too, because one of the issues that we continue to run into is people saying, like, look, I'm busy. I support what you're doing. I support what you're saying, but I don't have time to get involved. And that's why the service model and the electoral model function so poorly, right? And the answer to that is, I'm sorry, but that's not an option. Mm-hmm. It's just not. Like, if you want a world that is sustainable, that you can live on and that your children can survive in, you have to do something now. You have to get involved, right? So, like, I know it feels terrible. I know it's depressing. I know it's difficult to get motivated to get involved in these kinds of things. It is. It's tough for all of us. But you don't have a choice anymore. You don't. None of us do, right? So, like, if we want to save ourselves, we have to do so democratically. And the only way we're going to do that is organizing our workplaces in that way. So, that one is one I continue to bump up against, which is people like, listen, that model of unionism worked for me because I don't have time for that. And my answer and your answer, everybody's listening answer has to be, that's not an option anymore.
It, again, kind of creates a feedback loop.
Right.
You don't have time because of the conditions of your workplace.
Right.
So these systems can become very entrenched that way.
Right.
It's always something we need to
Right. And
fight
so
against.
we slide towards a service model because it's the easy way out. The same reason we slide towards electoral politics, because it's the easy way out. But we only have ourselves to blame when that system fails to meet our needs, because we know, and we know in our heart of hearts that that is the problem, right? Electoral politics is a problem because it never will give us what we vote for. If we could vote our way into socialism, it would have happened before now. It won't happen because they have built a system to make sure it doesn't happen. So that's the easy way out, right? And this is why Jay McAlevy's book on this topic is called No Shortcuts, because that's what we are inclined to do. We're tired. We're exploited. We're sad and depressed. We're anxious.
We're alone.
We're alone, right? We are disconnected and disorganized. And so the easy way to feel like you're doing something is to just do the bare minimum. And then what we get out of that is the bare minimum.
Do you feel like our increasing social interaction on online spaces and social media has kind of contributed to this kind of model?
Yeah.
I know in the video, she talked about how those face-to-face conversations are really important.
Totally. Right. So this dovetails with, I mean, I'm wearing both of my hats now because my academic discipline is media studies. And so one of the things I teach a lot about is social media, and democracy. And one of the major issues, especially for older Americans, is actually less true for younger people. The younger people are much more inclined to believe that social media is not a good organizing space. But it's the older people who are dead set believing that Facebook and Twitter is all that you need to organize people. And it is wrong. In fact, like, I encourage my students to consume as little news as possible.
Yes.
And to be on social media as little as possible, which is an easy step. But I tell them not to watch the news because the news isn't going to do anything. It's designed to give you an emotional response, not a intellectual one. Right? It's only going to give you an immediate sort of dopamine hit, like, oh, these people are like me, or this thing happened, it made me feel sad, anxious, whatever. And then that all disappears, you feel sad, and then you slink away, right? Like, having face-to-face conversations about working conditions, for example, does a lot better job. And I think that our media system is, again, it's designed not to serve the interests of activism, but to serve the interests of capital, which is what it does, right? It doesn't give you a platform to make your voice heard, right? It gives you a platform to scream into the void so other people will hear you while they're screaming into the void, right? Mm-hmm. It is a distraction, much like electoral politics and service model unionism is, right? It sends us in the wrong direction. It's a shortcut. And it's, again, we've been inclined to believe that, like, I can reach a large network of people by putting this out on social media. That's a good first step, right? We believe that that's true. Mm-hmm. But what does that end up doing? Well, maybe we get 50 people to a protest, but I don't even know any of their names. I don't even know why they're here. I don't know if they're going to come to the next one, right? And then they go away because why would your employer give a shit? Why would your politicians give a shit about 50, 75, 100 people showing up to a protest who don't know each other? And when this problem exists again tomorrow, they're at home, right? That's why we fail, right? That's why we are stuck here, is because we've accepted these models for activism and for work that are totally designed to ensure nothing happens, nothing changes, nothing gets better. So the work is long, right? Like, organizing a union like at UWM here, it's going to be a year or two before I feel confident that we're going to be in a position to do anything major. In the meantime, I think we will grow and we'll start to see it. But, like, if we're talking about full scale, activism, strikes, work stoppages, that's going to require a lot of time, right? It's going to require a lot of conversations. And the issue is that we tend to adopt shortcuts to get there, which is, again, why we fail. Because, if you want it, you have to go through the whole process, right? You have to do it the long way.
You see a lot of calls for general strikes on social media, but you can't just do that. Yeah, you have to do the...
This is exactly what I think. I've been pretentiously lecturing people on this.
Yeah.
I'm so happy.
If you look at the general strikes that have actually historically happened, both in this country and abroad, it followed years of organizing. You can't just magically summon it.
Yeah. And if you do, you only weaken yourself because you humiliate yourself in front of the people in power and you remind them that you are not a threat to them, right? That's why, like, calls on social media for a general strike are so stupid. Like, and that's what they are. They're stupid. They're being perpetuated by people who don't understand any of what organizing takes, right? Organizing takes a long time. It takes a lot of conversations, right? It means talking to the people who do not agree with you about unionism or politics. It requires getting them to understand why it matters. Because if you can't get them to show up, the employer doesn't give a shit. The politicians don't care either, right? Because they say, well, of course, this is like the 75, 100 activists who are always pissed off and they're always going to be angry. And so they're neutral. They're not going to do anything, right? They're weak. But when that group of people is also able to bring in, diverse coalitions of workers who, again, have not been involved in unionism, have not been involved in activism, who traditionally don't even share politics with those activists, but they're there and saying, I'm willing to go out on strike right now. That's a different situation, right? That's one that scares employers. That's one that scares politicians because they know now that's real democracy.
And I can't believe we haven't talked about this yet, but Chris Smalls, the Amazon unionizing, that's exactly what we're talking about, that deep organizing. And I want to highlight, too, that, okay, it might take 2 or 3 years before we're ready to make major action, but those 2 or 3 years are kind of fun.
Yeah.
They're kind of nice. The process, Chris Smalls, it was cookouts. It was hangouts in your house. It was getting to know the people around you so that you have a community. At 2 to 3 years, it's good. It could be very nice.
It would be very nice, right? It would be rebuilding, not necessarily your union, but rebuilding your democracy, right? Rebuilding the idea that like the people that I spend time around in my community are not strangers, right? They are humans and I care about them and I want them to be successful, right? So I need to know what their issues are. I want to know what happens in their households. I want to know what their family's concerns are so that we can connect as human beings. And then, only then do we start to put that into action to say like, I'm here for you and you're here for me. So what you need, I will give you and vice versa. That's what Chris Smalls did at the Amazon Union, which is why he was able to topple this juggernaut, right? Because he didn't take any shortcuts, right? He said like, we have to do this the long way, but the long way is how we build the network that we need to be successful. Mm-hmm. And this is why if you want to build something that is successful, you cannot accept a shortcut. You have to do it the long way. But I agree 100%. It's what makes you feel invested in supporting your community. It also gives you the motivation to continue this fight because it reminds you that like I'm doing this for a reason and I'm bringing in people that, again, this is why like the sort of tribalism of electoral politics is so dangerous and ugly, right? Because it separates you from the divide from the get-go to be like, this is a Trumper, right? Like, fuck that person. I'm not going to work with you. I'm not saying like, you know, there's lots of conspiracy theory racists who we should obviously compartmentalize in this, but there are a lot of people who have been motivated to vote for Trump for economic reasons, right? For reasons that are working class in nature, right? You say like, Trump isn't going to fix that. The Republicans aren't going to fix that for you. The Democrats aren't either. We can fix it together. We can, because your concerns actually matter to me, right? That's how you get people to understand why socialism isn't something to be scared of or unionism isn't, right? Because you say like, I'm not trying to funnel money to the Democratic Party, right? I stand against that idea. What I want to do is I want you to join the union and pay dues so that we can improve your working conditions so you can have more time with your family. I don't really care what you do in your private and spare time. I just want to make sure that you have what you need. And we're only going to do that together.
And this kind of connection is very hard to stop people from doing. We all have the power to do it. I mean, no matter what laws they pass. I think with Act 10, maybe you can attest, did you see some kind of defeatism or people thinking we can't build unions anymore?
Yes. I'm glad you brought up Act 10 because it is a significant hurdle, although it ought not be. So I just moved up to Canada to start grad work when this happened, my PhD. I came back here to occupy the Capitol with all the other activists. I felt this incredible working class energy when I was there. And I felt all these workers and teachers and public sector employees were really motivated and galvanized to do something. And then what did the unions do? Instead of organizing general strikes of just workers in Wisconsin, public sector workers, they initiated a recall election of Scott Walker, which failed. Further entrenching him. Electoral politics, right? They tried to take a shortcut. And now what did we get? We got nothing. We got defeatism, right? We got a generation of workers now who believe that there isn't any point in being involved in the union because in this case, the union tried to help the Democrats, failed miserably, and then undercut their own ability. They could have done something about Act 10 if they had organized a general strike, which there was plenty of workers around the state willing to do at the time.
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands of workers who were willing to stay out of the classrooms, march on the Capitol, to stay out of work for as long as it took. And instead, I mean, again, if you need any other proof that what I'm saying is true, look no further than what happened after Act 10. And then after that, right, a lot of these workers just threw in the towel that like there isn't any point in this. We can't form a union. I mean, workers, higher ed workers on UW campuses can't register or can't certify as a union under Act 10 anyway. So that doesn't even apply to me, right? To us, like we're allowed to. We can't.
I was wondering that.
Yeah, so like there's a certification process which is designed to make it impossible for unions to exist in public sector spaces here. Basically, you have to hold an annual election for certification, and you have to pay a fee for the privilege of certifying your union. And then once you certify, you're only allowed to bargain for wages, nothing else, and those wages are tied to inflation. So it basically is pointless. I mean, MTEA does it, like the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association does it, but most other unions don't bother with certification. And again, higher ed locals can't do it anyways. So it's a moot point. And again, when faculty specifically ask me about Act 10 and like why I'm doing this, we can't really even bother. I have to remind them that like if a politician was going to make it illegal for you to organize a union, they will. And they have done that since the birth of the working class. They will always do it. There is no such thing as a labor action that is legally sanctioned because the state stands diametrically opposed to the needs of the working class. So they will always be against us on this, no matter what we do. So why should we care about whether or not they say, you can do this or you could do that? Like, that's illegal, but that's not. This is fine, but only like this. Like,
you can't stand that close to
right.
the picket line. No.
Right. You're not going to tell me, like, I'm not going to ask permission from a gerrymandered group of politicians about whether or not my children are allowed to survive on this planet. Right. I'm not asking for that permission. I don't care about their consent to it. I will do what I feel like doing anyways. So, again, maybe that argument worked when a lot of these workers were concerned about whether or not whether or not climate change was going to take this planet away from them. But now I think we're in a very different situation where, like, I couldn't care less about the legalities of this at all. I mean, the state doesn't grant us the right to survive, right? We decide ourselves democratically if we want to survive here, and then we're going to do what it takes to do that. At least I will.
Hear. I love it, Eric. Well, thanks for sitting down with us today.
Yeah,
I don't know
pleasure.
if you have anything else you want to talk about.
No, I mean, if anybody hears this and wants to get involved with AFT Local 3535, reach out to me, or any of the members of the executive. Hit us up on Twitter would probably be the easiest way to get in contact with us. And then, let's get to work.
We'll link all that stuff.
All right. Thanks for having me on, fellas.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
See you, Eric.
Thanks.